In the late 1970s, the American sociologist Lee Rainwater became acquainted with Gaston Chabert, a Luxembourgish psychologist. Gaston directed a research institute in Luxembourg known as CEPS. He also held a faculty position at Clark University in Worcester, Massachusetts. Gaston and Lee came together again in August of 1982 at a conference on poverty that was held at Clark University. The Swedish sociologist Robert Erickson was also there, as were several other European and American social scientists. Participants at the Clark Conference discussed the idea of creating a cross-national project that would enable high-quality comparative research. Those conversations led to the launch of the Luxembourg Income Study in 1983 in Luxembourg. Three people who were involved from its inception, Lee Rainwater, Robert Erickson, and Tim Smeeding, remember LIS's beginnings. Three others who helped LIS to take root and develop, Serge Allegrezza, Marg Cigrang, and John Coder, also contribute their early memories.
I knew Gaston because he had looked me up, because he had asked a colleague at Clark who in the Cambridge area was concerned with problems of poverty. That was Tamara Haraven, who was a professor of history at Clark. And she invited me to dinner to meet Gaston. And then Gaston invited me up to Luxembourg a couple of times, if I remember correctly, just to talk, or in one case to listen in on a conference he had of the people from the different poverty studies in Europe. So when he presented the idea to me and to Marty Ryan, who was with me, he said he would like to have a conference at Clark, bring people from Europe over, and meet with some Americans who did poverty research.
My first meeting with Lee was in the 1960s. Lee came to Stockholm in order to use the level of living study from 1968, and from that on we had quite a lot of contact. And so I had a long experience of Lee as an excellent sociologist and a good person. Gaston I only met at the first, meeting where LIS was more or less decided upon without being formally established at Clark University in Massachusetts. That was and I didn't meet Gaston before that.
So we talked back and forth. He had his own crew from Luxembourg, and he knew the people who had done other poverty studies in Europe for this European Union project. But he didn't know anything about the work that was done in the Scandinavia on levels of living. So I told him about Sten Johansson and Robert Erickson, and pointed out they represent a different way of going at this than the people he was working with, particularly in Luxembourg. And I gave him the names of poverty researchers from the Poverty Institute.
And Lee was the one who had the ideas of looking at income inequality, looking at comparative studies of income inequality, to have the basis for doing that, etc. I think that all that was clearly Lee's contribution, and so I think that if one should really point at somebody who is the father of LIS, it is Lee Rainwater. Gaston. The important point with Gaston Chabert was that he could organize the infrastructure. He had a lot of contact. He had more or less direct access to the Prime Minister of Luxembourg. He was a very interesting person.
Anyway, we discussed in Clark the idea that we could bring our data together from different countries. We were all doing very similar kinds of work, and the data would support really serious comparable work across countries. So we should try to put together a project that would do that. Gaston must have said that he would try to fund it, and it turned in, and we left it there, basically. It was an idea. We hoped it would work. Gaston was going to go look for funding. Gaston called in the fall to say that he was ready and we should find somebody to run the project. And he said, well, of course, you'll run it. And I said, no, as he sometimes is fond of saying these days. I said, no, I'm too old. We need somebody who's younger.
It turns out that I found out later that in 1982, there was a conference on comparative poverty at the Clark University that was run by Gaston Chabert with Lee Rainwater and a whole bunch of Europeanists who were doing the European Poverty Definition Program 2. And I got to know these people later, but I wasn't invited. And what happened is each individual person at the conference brought their paper on their own country and about poverty in their own country. But of course, they all measured it differently. They all used different poverty lines. They all adjusted for family size differently. And at the end of the day, there was hash. No one could say anything comparative at all. So it was a little bit frustrating afterwards. And as Lee and Gaston were talking about what could be done better, they said, you could probably do something better, but it would be a lot of work. And they asked Sheldon Danziger and Irv Garfinkel, gee, who'd be willing to do something as goofy as this? And they both said Tim Smeeding. Of course, they didn't tell me that before I went to Luxembourg, but the idea was that I knew enough about the data and was interested enough in the issues based on my thesis that I might be interested in this.
In 1983, 2 planning meetings to design the LIS project were held in Luxembourg. The first one took place in April. Tim Smeeding traveled to Luxembourg for the first time to attend that meeting. A second planning meeting was held that August.
I wasn't quite sure where Luxembourg was. I knew it was small. I think I knew it was a country and not a city, but wasn't too sure. And the idea that there was a research center there and there was a whole group of people interested in this stuff was okay. Now, if we're in the 21st century and I could have Googled it, I might not have even got on a plane. But on April 4th, 1983, I got off a plane in Luxembourg, took the train out to Walferdang, walked across the train tracks, and there was somebody there looking for me. Now you couldn't send an email to say that they canceled the plane yesterday, so it was a day later, but Gaston had sent Mr. Creer, his aide-de-camp, out looking for me to see if I was on the train, and sure enough, I was.
And then the next meeting was held in Walferdang in Luxembourg, in Gaston's, in the old military barracks there. And I think it was at that time it was the first time that Tim appeared. And Lee had found him somewhere, it seemed in the Midwest, but probably not. But this was the impression one got. And so that was in the first time Tim appeared.
We liked his style, and so we got in touch with him, and he was interested. And so that put us in position to launch the project, which the next April, we made a trip to Luxembourg, Marty and I and Tim. It was to see whether this would work for Tim and for Gaston. And Marty and I I remember waited in in the office that Gaston had given us while while Tim and Gaston met and talked. And we had our fingers crossed because these were obviously two very large egos. And were they going to get along? And they got along well enough.
We showed up in Luxembourg and we had a 4-day meeting in August trying to figure out how to go about putting this thing together. And it was at the end of that meeting that I met with Gaston. I said, I think we're ready to try and start out harmonizing income, putting it to a common template. And he said, well, we have to have a name for this project. And I said, yeah. And he said, well, there's Luxembourg, yeah, and it's going to be about income. And he said, the Luxembourg Income Survey. I said, no, people will think we're collecting data then. How about the Luxembourg Income Study? LIS, yes, that's it. And so that's when LIS was born then.
For the first time ever, in 1984, LIS made harmonized microdata available to researchers. The 7 countries included in this inaugural release were Canada, Israel, Germany, Norway, Sweden, the United Kingdom, and the United States.
I think the key ingredient is quality of comparative data. I mean, that, in my view, has all the time been the most central aspect of LIS, and the most important aspect of LIS is that to make it possible to have a comparison of income data and in principle some other data as well between countries where you believe that differences are real differences and not just artifacts.
It was the first time I heard about it. Luxembourg Income Study. Really didn't understand what it looked like. And at that time, Mr. Gaston Chambers, the director of CPS, tried to explain to me that it was putting up a kind of a huge data bank with individual data on household and income. And it was really funny. It sounded very funny to me because I thought this kind of thing should exist already. And I was very surprised to discover that this was something which had to be built, had to be constructed by researchers. And if you make it in a comparative way, if you want to compare data of various countries during time, then you have to put all this data together. And I found this project very, very exciting. And I was asked that if I would agree that I could join this team as a researcher.
The original idea, and the idea all ever since, was to build a database that lots of people could use. To some extent, in my mind, that was influenced by the fact that in the U.S. we were moving toward requirements by funders that people who work with data had to make that data available to other researchers. This was just the idea from the beginning, you make it available. That's why sometimes I call it a data utility, that anyone can use for whatever purpose is appropriate with the data. And people kind of like that.
So I think that it was always very exciting for me to work with the LIS team, and especially with Tim, because he had very bright ideas and he knew exactly where he wanted to go, and he was even capable to motivate us and to make the work very, very exciting. And I must say that knowing that we had these conferences, international conferences, where all the papers have been presented and discussed, was something quite new, even for Luxembourg. We must admit that at that time, which is, I think, today everything changed in this field. We have a university, we have research centers, but you must imagine that at that time, except the SEPS, which was a non-profit organization at the time, and it became only later, it became an institute, and publicly recognized institute. supported by government. So LIS was a very important contribution, and Tim Smeeding, Lee Rainwater was highly recognized even by our policymakers. I must say that we were very lucky with Mr. Santerre, the Prime Minister at that time, because he was naturally someone who was ready to support this kind of projects. But the institutions were not ready to do it. And so it was quite an achievement to convince other decision makers in Luxembourg to support this project.
LIS is primarily known for its substantive contribution, harmonizing cross-national microdata and making them available for research. Equally important in LIS's legacy was the invention of the remote access system known as LISI. LISI revolutionized the way that social scientists carried out research using the LIS data. The LISI system enabled researchers to analyze the microdata while working in their home offices around the world. Starting in 1983, Tim Smeeding worked closely with Günter Schmaus at CEPS. Günter played a crucial role in helping researchers to perform analyses using the harmonized data. Between 1986 and 1989, Marg Cigrang and Minna de Wong, both working at CEPS, and John Coder, on loan from the U.S. Census Bureau, joined the LIS project. Together, they built LISI, which is now in its 8th generation.
The way that people got the data originally from LIS is Günter would make all the runs. According to what I told him, that was it, full stop. And we shipped the runs and the tables and the output to people. That's the way it was at first. But we knew that a system whereby people would send in a request for a run, some LIS person would make the run and send it back to them, didn't work with the way the world was changing. So Lee Rainwater, sitting on the 4th floor in his office in William James Hall, sent his programs upstairs to the 11th floor to be run. And he said, and he used something called BitNet. And he said, if I can send them to the 11th floor, why can't I send them to Luxembourg and have them run there? That'd be great, but we need a system that's got to deal with this. So then we were in a pickle, because John was still there at this point, and we realized we had to have access for everybody, and that was a big selling point. And John had met this guy who was a Luxembourger named Marg Cigrang. He was in the next office, and he was doing brain research or something. Mark and John got to be good friends, and they together built this remote access system called LISI. And the idea was that they had to protect the data. The important thing was nobody could compromise confidentiality. The reason we were in Luxembourg, you have to remember, is they had the strongest data protection laws in the world.
I started to work in '86 in Luxembourg for the CEPS Institute. I had to meet people at that time that were there, like Tim Smeeding and Lee Rainwater, and I especially got in contact with it the second year I was working there in '87, when they wanted to make a new system for accessing the Luxembourg income study data, which I think at that time were 7 countries, 6 or 7 countries. In fact, at that time, one of the contributions that Luxembourg made to the project, which was in fact a very big contribution, was to give us free access at the state computer, which is called the Centre Informatique d'État, where we had access to their mainframe. And as at that time the storage capacities were still a very big issue, there was a company, I don't remember the name of the company, but one person that worked there was Günter Schmaus, who had developed a special system that had as purpose to zip the files, to compress the files in a way that they could be stored, so that there was access given to these data files, but only manually. People submitting jobs at the time had to send in a letter or whatever just telling Günter Schmaus what he had to key in, get the listing out, put it in a good old-fashioned envelope and send it by standard mail back to the people. That was the first, in fact, what we would call LISI 1 at that time. So a pure manual system and the data stored on the mainframe of the State Computer Center. The purpose was to have a system where you could bypass this process where you had to really manually write a letter or send something, because email, which is today, you cannot imagine living without email. At that time, email was not existing, internet was not existing, so there was none of these modern communication means that we have today. But there was one network that was coming up, which was an IBM-financed network for academics. And then we tried to get access to this network in order to have this communication means. And to get access to that, we had to go to Brussels, to the IBM, the European headquarters of IBM, to present the project. And they then decided that this was worth giving access to us to the EarnBitNet. And that's how the whole communication part was started.
I met Tim, must have been in the late 70s, when he came to the Census Bureau to do his renowned research on valuing non-cash benefits. And about 4 years later, Tim called me up and said, "How would you like to come to Luxembourg and do a presentation? We're having I think one of the early kind of conferences, the LIS conferences then." So I went over and gave a presentation there at CEPS, and went back home, and then we had contact on and off, and somehow one day he said, "Gee, would you like to come to Luxembourg and work here?" And at the time I was at this, working at the Census Bureau, a little bit bored, and it was like I was jumping up and down. This was going to be an adventure of a lifetime. And so I went to the people at the Census Bureau. I said, "I'd like to go to Luxembourg for a year and a half. Is that okay with you?" And they said yes. And so that's how I ended up there.
Tim, at that time, you could not miss him, because he was the loudest person that ever went ever came to this building. So you noticed him immediately. But aside that, in the meetings we had just to define what we want to do in all these planning meetings. That's how I got to know Rainwater first, and also Tim Smeeding. John Coder was there, of course, all the time too, and especially also Claude Consemius from the Computer Center. So we had these meetings always with these 5 people, where we just decided what to do and how to do. And Lee was more concerned about the technical side, the feasibility of, on one hand. Tim, he was much more involved in trying to get the countries and sell these ideas outside. But it was very constructive and very, it were really people building something instead of everybody having a very precise function. So it was really some people that had one aim: we have to get this thing to work and to make it big.
Marg Cigrang was there doing a lot of geospatial things, very innovative things there, with mapping and satellite mapping and just amazing things. And he being rather clever and intelligent and wanting new challenges, he sort of hooked on to the group. And he and his now wife Minna was working there in CEPS as well at the time. And they did a lot of programming for the early LIS system.
In fact, nobody gave us ever any instructions. The most fantastic thing about this whole making of LISI was that never ever anybody told us, "Are you crazy?" or tried to stop us from doing things, nor at the computer center, because they should have been really concerned with, they had a close eye on it, of course, but they never tried to stop us, and so we could always do what we wanted to do. And I think that if we had a lot of people around us telling us what to do and how to do, and do not like this, do not like that, I think it would not work as it was working today, because it was, I think, more our naive approach and innocent approach, really, because I think we were not really aware of what we were doing. And today the result is good, so, but nobody ever tried to stop us.
And of course, we started the workshops too. It was a first workshop. I guess it was workshop in '88. Was the first one, and that was another aspect of it. It was all of a sudden you're invaded by people from all over the planet, and they came to see what you're doing. That's pretty impressive.
Just one remark about the first workshop. That shortened my lifetime expectation, because the system was running the first time correctly 2 hours before the workshop started. John Koder and myself really lost some lifetime expectation in there. But we had a very nice user interface.
I'll never forget the first time I put in a whole bunch of runs, and just seeing them roll off the printer with all of those countries, I think maybe we had 9 countries by that time, was very, very exciting. And then the fact that once the internet got going and email, the fact that this could become a totally automatic process was also very exciting, at least for me. Lots of people treat those issues as, well, I hope it works, and if it does work, good, but they weren't really interested in the nuts and bolts of it. But that was an extra bonus in a way, a non-social science bonus from building the project.
At the time, I think nobody could imagine that this project would get what it is today. I think everybody believed that it would continue to exist, but not grow in this way, have so many countries, especially so many users, and through the years getting a real standard for a lot of things, for comparative studies in the more scientific way to look at it. From a technical point of view, the LIS system is in many publications today shown as the grandfather of all systems. So I think nobody believed that it would get what it is today. Of course, everybody thought it has to survive, but not at this extent.
Altogether, the idea was that we were in this together. We were trying to learn from each other. We realized that we were providing customers with something. And we kept, I think, to the motto I set back in 1988, which was work hard, play hard. That was how I lived my life, and everyone knew that at the project. It wasn't always safe driving with me, and it certainly wasn't safe drinking with me. But we were sincere about helping people, and I think that reputation has carried us to this point.
In the early time when this was started, comparisons of income data was just based on what was produced by the governments. And what the governments produced were, of course, not comparable. And this was, I think, the most important aspect. And this is the intellectual achievement, to see both that it had to be done and it could be done, which I think is a piece of intellectual, shall we say, courage.
The great event of my life, one of them anyway, in September 2008, the University of Stockholm offered me, and I received an honorary doctorate for the work I'd done with LIS. It was just absolutely amazing, totally blown away. Me, an honorary degree. I had a wonderful time, and I'll always have fond memories and a special place in my heart for LIS. Lee and I are really proud of what we started, and even prouder of what's being grown out of it.
To be president of LIS, I must say, was only for one period of hard work. Otherwise, since this was a project that was following exactly the ideas I had about how how comparative work should be done, or rather, what the infrastructure for comparative work should look like. In that respect, I was very happy about being president of a nice institute.
So, I guess in the end we were lucky. I think we did well because of hard work and because of luck, and because I had Lee as a partner and now Janet and Marcus after us, because we've had loyal employees like Caroline for 20 years, more than 20, 22 years, and because they're just really good people. So I'm thankful. Lee, I think in his retirement said, this will be the most important thing I've done. He thought that. Now this is Lee Rainwater, who's done a lot of really important work, in case you didn't understand what ghettos were about in the 60s, 70s, and 80s and so forth. So Lee could claim fame to a bunch of other stuff. Not me. The best thing I will ever do, have done, is LIS. And I'm really proud of what we could be accomplished again and where the project's going.